Well, hello. Welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast, where we talk with writers from all mediums and genres about themselves, their work, and advice they have for writers. I'm your host, Paul Zeidman, and my guest today is the author James R. Bateman. We'll be talking about his book today, Savior of Lost Souls. James, welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast.
Thank you, Paul. Nice to be here. Thank you very much.
Oh, it is my pleasure. And as followers of the show are familiar, we like to start things off talking about things we may have read or watched lately. Did we like them? Did we not like them? Do we want to have nothing to do with them whatsoever ever again in our lives? I'll go first just to give James a little time to collect his thoughts because that seems to be the way it works around here. Not a lot on the watching front just because I'm getting ready to shoot my short film in just over a week and a half. So that's taken up a lot of my time. But that being said, I've tried to take a little time to decompress, if you will. And so it was inspired by listening to a friend's podcast about screenplays. So I watched Pee-wee's Big Adventure yet again. Still holds up. The jokes are great. The comedy is hilarious. And it's just a very entertaining film. Hard to believe it's like, I don't know, 40 years old now. But
40, wow. Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed that.
yeah, apart from the fashions, you wouldn't know that. But I really enjoyed it. And it was a great use of, I think it was like, it's only an hour and a half. So perfect time and just enough to forget all my troubles and enjoy watching Pee Wee Herman and Paul Rubens. James, what about you?
So what have I watched recently? I watched actually the latest Mission Impossible film
Hmm.
at the movies, which was great. Went with my wife. I really enjoyed it. I don't know if this is out in the US, but there's a TV show on Paramount Plus called Mobland, which is
Hmm.
really good. Tom Hardy, Pierce Brosnan, Helen Mirren. It's about sort of gang life in London, but that's by a director called Guy Ritchie, which you may
Oh,
be
okay.
familiar
I've heard
with.
of Guy
So yeah,
Ritchie.
yeah. So it's a great TV show, kind of easy watching. Not one you can binge watch. Well, you probably can now because all the episodes are out. But it
Hmm.
was one that was each week a new episode was released, and they kind of get you hooked so that once you've watched episode one, you're kind of waiting for the following week for episode two. Also, what else? I've been watching Daredevil, Born Again.
Oh, okay. What did what
Yeah,
did
which
you
was
what did
great.
you think what do you think about that?
I thought it was good. It was better than I thought it'd be as it switched from Netflix over to Disney. But I think
Hmm.
they carried on the character and kept the fans interested by keeping the Marvel the Netflix rather feel to it. But there's a few things in there you could tell which were changed during the sort of the process of development. But overall, I thought it was really good.
Yeah, I enjoyed it as well. I think from what I recall, like they had filmed maybe like one or two episodes and then they decided to totally start over from scratch and just eliminated a lot of things, which I thought was a very bold move, but I think for the most part it paid off. I enjoyed it too. I'm really looking forward to seeing how they pull or I
Yeah.
guess conclude the story whenever it comes back for season two. Okay, so James Bateman, let's talk a little bit about you before we get to your book, Savior of Lost
Okay.
Souls. So what is your background as a writer? I mean, were you a writer and a voracious reader as a child? Is it something you came to a little later in life, or something you were just sitting in the office one day and said, "Ah, I've got an idea for a book," and just started writing things down?
I've always been a reader. I've always enjoyed reading books, from children's books, which is in the UK, Enid Blyton and things like that when I was a child, through to Stephen King more recently, 20, 30 years ago. But what else have I like? I like reading comedy books. I'm currently reading or actually listening to because I enjoy the Audible
Mhm.
books as well. Dungeon Crawler Carl. I don't know if you've come across that,
It
but
doesn't. I'm not familiar with that one.
yeah, it's one of those ones which was recommended to listen to. I thought, what is this about? And I thought, and the guy who recommended it said, just listen to it. You'll enjoy it. I thought it sounds dubious, but I listened to it and I thought this is, one of those things when you are at work, stressful day at work, and you want something to sort of zone out and laugh about. The Dungeon Crawler Call is definitely it. But an author called Matt Dinnerman who basically wrote this book about a guy who left his apartment building looking for his cat. The whole world collapsed, all the buildings collapsed, and he went into this sort of computer game world, so to speak, RPG world under the Earth's ground. And it was only him and his cat and a few other humans that survived. And it's just really funny. So if you're into something where you want to have a good laugh, then I would definitely recommend Dungeon Crawler Call. There's about I think 8 or 9 books in the series at the
Oh my gosh.
so yeah.
That is fascinating. I've never heard of that one, but what an intriguing concept and a good pitch. And speaking of pitches, so let us talk about your book. Actually, you know what? Before I do that, what I like to do is I like to read the author bio, which is usually in the book here. I think it was here. Oh my
Yes,
goodness.
right at the back it should be.
Okay, I'm
The other way
looking.
around that you're probably used to.
Yeah, well, it's here somewhere, I'm sure. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, here we go. About the author. Born and raised in Staffordshire, England, James Bateman has spent over 30 years in the IT and software industry. Throughout his technical career, he developed a fascinating with storytelling and narrative development, eventually leading him to delve into fiction writing. James crafts tales that blend elements of fantasy, urban fiction, and crime, aiming to entertain and engage readers with thought-provoking themes. His stories showcase the resilience of the human spirit and explore the interplay between life, death, and morality. In his free time, James enjoys reading, playing video games, staying active, and spending time with his family. His work reflects a commitment to exploring human experiences and offering narratives that captivate and inspire deeper consideration of the world. That is a very heady part of the bio. Usually it's, I live in Los Angeles with my cat and my wife, that type of thing. Okay, so that is a little bit about you. So let's talk about Savior of Lost Souls. So give us what we like to call the elevator pitch. The fast blurb says, "Oh, James, tell me about your new book."
Yeah, so Savior of Lost Souls. If you could imagine a world where awful things happen and people think they've got away with it doing these awful things, but imagine a world where there's a God in a particular realm that can hear the cries of lost souls, lives that have been taken before their time was due, and goes back to the time and the place where this crime happens to try and prevent it from happening in the first place. Um, yeah, so if you think you've gotten away with something, if you think you've done a crime and you've gotten away with it, the idea is that to actually think about that because things will always catch up with you, whether on this earth or whether within the other realms out there.
Oh my goodness. So what was the inspiration for the story? Was this something that you'd kind of been tinkering with for a while, or just maybe the idea just kind of hit you like a bolt from the blue?
Well, there's actually a story that I wrote probably around 2011, 2012, originally as a comic book script.
Oh, okay.
So I wrote this as a comic book script. I'll get into the inspiration in a second, but I wrote as a script. I couldn't find an illustrator, so it kind of just sat on my computer drive, eventually OneDrive for a number of years, and someone convinced me to bring it out again and have a look at it and convert it into a novel. But the inspiration came, there's, in the UK specifically at the time, because that's obviously where I live, but there's some horrendous crimes that happen about awful things that happen to children. And this guy, I kind of remember vividly, was on the news making a plea to say, please, can someone help me to find whoever did this to these children?
Hmm.
And it turned out to be that guy that did it to the children. He was there making the plea on the news, and he was eventually found and imprisoned. But I thought at the time, what an awful thing for someone to do. To do this to these children. What would be really good was to be able to stop it from happening. It's happened, but what if you could go back, stop it from happening, and to the person that did it, do to them what they originally did to the children. So it's kind of where the retribution theme comes from. Obviously, you or I or any kind of person, human being couldn't do that. But what if there was a being out there, a God that actually listens to cries of the lost souls, and that's where that came from. And actually, souls that go to this realm, this purgatory realm that I've
Hmm.
labeled old den. What if these souls go there because they deep within themselves they feel that their lives were ended before they should have been ended, and they've got this yearning to live. But in order to live, they have to go through this death loop of the events that have happened to them over and over again for this
Hmm.
God, my main character Levesque, to hear, to then go to a time and the place where it happened. He doesn't know who it is that it's happened to. He doesn't know who did it to them. He doesn't know what happened to them, but he has flashes of their memory that goes into his own mind, and he has to put together the pieces of the puzzle to figure out who did it, who the person is, and how we can get to them in time to stop it from happening again. But the inspiration came from these awful things that happen in the world, and you wish, every good person wishes that there's a way of preventing it from happening.
Of course, of course. Yeah, I wrote down, I consider the book equal parts thriller and fantasy with a little examination of good versus evil. So was that your original intent, or did things change along the way? Did you like have an original idea and then just as you were working on the story, think, okay, maybe tweak this a little bit or, switch this around?
Yeah, I did because I suppose it was originally a comic book script. You kind of hope the visualization of it is in the drawing of a comic book script. So as I converted into a novel, I had to expand that visualization into written word. But it initially started off of this being this god, Levesque, who started off with this person, this child leading up to their untimely death, and Levesque going back to try and stop it from happening.
Hmm.
But as I started to write that down into novel form, I realized that it couldn't just be half of it without him and then the other half with him. I had to sort of intermingle the two halves that I had in my mind originally. And as I was starting to write it and develop it, I kind of thoughts came into mind about what if there's other god type characters out there. There's Marin, who is the goddess of Etden, which is the heaven realm, which wasn't in the original comic book script. It just occurred to me as I was going through it, and then I thought, what if there's another realm as well, which is the hell realm, which I've called Akdan, and there was a god type character that resided there, and his name is Kalok. So
Hmm.
all of these three gods came into my mind. Originally it was just Levesque and Peter, who was the main bad guy, and it was always in it. But I
Hmm.
expanded his character a little bit and brought these other gods into it to sort of delve into, I suppose, more not so much spiritual, but more good versus evil versus a blurred line between the two.
Sure, sure. Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask that. It's really fascinating the way you portray the worlds of the gods, and I was trying to figure out, like, or I wanted, was curious, how did you develop that the world and the rules of these fantasy realms? I mean, you started with Levesque, and it grew from there. I guess you figured, okay, I have essentially quotes unquotes a good guy, so
Yeah.
I need a counter to him, but also like that, as you said, that blurred line between.
Yeah, I mean, it was the rule for Levesque's realm was there in my mind originally, and that was there within the comic book script. And his rule is that, he has to hear and connect with these lost souls. He may or he may not. So it's not
Hmm.
like everyone that goes to his realm he has an opportunity to save. So he has to, I guess, tune in, and eventually it connects to one individual soul and goes to that time and place to prevent it from happening. The Etdem realm, I suppose it was which is heaven, was my idea, my concept of if there is a heaven, what would that be like? What would be the supreme beauty of that realm? What would be the rules within there? And I just, it's always nice to think that there'll be a heaven, but if you die and you go there as an old person, if you die and go there as a young person, how does it all intermingle? And I had these ideas in my mind as how it all fits together. But the whole thing, like the Hell Akden realm, I just had this vision of it being switched from a fiery hell to an ice cold hell, and that was like, I suppose that possible inspiration came from probably my wife, who thinks it's really cold in the house, and actually that's her version version of hell, so we have to turn the heating on. But the rules there are, Kalok is there, he's trapped there, and he can't leave there, but he has this ability to manipulate his realm and the people within there to his own liking. But underpinning it all is this energy. So that the energy of I've called, because if you notice, it's Akden, which is hell, Etden, which is heaven, Ulden, which is this purgatory realm. I call them the realms of Den, and within this realms of Den,
Hmm.
there's this energy that ties it all together. There's no concept of time necessarily within these realms, but the concept of this energy which pulls it all together, and even in the realm that I called Gaiden, which is essentially Earth, had this energy until evil corrupted it, and this energy sort of started to dwindle on Earth. But this energy is there, connecting it all and connecting the gods together.
Yeah, one of the things I really liked as part of the story is that not only do you have these gods of good and evil, but that they're brothers.
Yes,
I thought
yeah.
that was a great touch. Not to touch too much on like the Thor Loki relationship, but
Or
people
Cain and
can
Abel, I
relate to that.
suppose, as well. Yeah.
So how was it for you to develop that relationship? I mean, you said you had Levesque first, and then you came up with the other characters. Did you think, okay, here is this character fighting for good, so I need a counter to him, and also that the other character, he's not necessarily evil. He doesn't go out of his way to do evil things. He just has, I guess, evil tendencies.
Mm.
And I just thought that was a really interesting touch that he's not I don't know if you would call him an agent of chaos, but he just kind of like he leans that way, maybe a little bit. So what was it, how was it for you to develop that relationship? And I guess was it a challenge to make them equals?
That was a very good question. I suppose that developed that relationship. It starts off as, I suppose, basic sibling rivalry,
Sure.
and Kalloch, as you say, is not necessarily evil. He just doesn't understand humanity. He just doesn't
Mm,
understand empathy. He doesn't understand emotion. He just sees it as, well, if someone dies, they die. If they're bad, they come to me. If they're good, they go to his mother in Etden. But now there's this, if it's something where they are good, but they're taken before their time, then Levesque has an opportunity to prevent it from happening. So that kind of rivalry is almost like, well, why does Levesque have that ability to prevent something from happening that's already happened? And he almost kind of gets used to it and thinks, well, I suppose if Levesque's doing that and there's this person is evil, I won't necessarily, make them evil. I won't necessarily convert them to good. I'll just give them this little nudge along their way to get them to continue to do what they're doing so that
hmm
he will, or he or she will end up in my realm of punishment for the evil. And the person that they may have done this atrocious thing to, so what? They go to heaven. So that's his basic concept of it. And Levesque has this more emotional side to it. Both of them, as you not to give away too much of the story, had this opportunity to witness mortal life and to
Mm,
go onto Earth and to sort of live as human beings. Levesque embraced it. He had the opportunity to embrace it and had a wife, had children. Kalloch just thought, this is way beneath me. Why am I here? And he
mm.
just took his sort of personality onto Earth and developed, a way of sort of creating this opportunity of free will in his mind. But actually, that free will is not so much about do good but do it in free will. It's more about, if you want to do bad, do bad. You do what you need to do. It's just who cares? And as a result of that, that kind of creates that sibling rivalry because Levesque is, well, you can't do that. Why is it your say to kind of manipulate people into doing bad? And Carlock's like, well, I'm not manipulating them. I'm just giving that nudge that they're already on that path anyway.
hmm Sure. You've raised a great point that a story like this is only as good or effective as its antagonist. In that case, this is Peter. Now, I thought you gave him some really viable and logical reasons why he acts the way he does. And so as I was reading him go through all of these terrible things he did, and we'll touch on that briefly in a second. Did you have to research that kind of personality? Did you have to figure out, okay, here's this person, here is what happened to them to make them the person they are now? And did you have to really dig deep into that kind of maybe like psychological study?
Well, I did do a little bit of research, and it was mainly around, some, like I mentioned, some of the crimes that happened, but that was many years ago.
hmm
And some of these crimes still happen. It's not necessarily linked to one place in this world. There's good, there's bad, and there's beautiful things in this world, and there's awful things in this world, regardless of where you live. But in the case of Peter, my original concept was he is just out and out bad. He's just got no reason to do any of this. He just was a little jealous, a little knocked by the person he works with, and the in his way of thinking, his incessant way of keep talking about their daughter, and it drives him insane. And actually, some of the early reader reviews came back and said, well, if you can you dive into Peter a bit more? And I always had this thought of there is more to him than meets the eye, but I hadn't put it onto paper. So I just thought, yeah, you're right. And I had this sort of backstory all written down and I explored that. And, things had happened to him as a child, which helped to possibly shape him as an adult. But I didn't want it to be too cliche, like, oh, I'm bad because my parents made me this way, sort of
Hmm.
thing. It's just that I tried to develop a character that was always inherently bad, but that thing that happened to him tipped him over the edge,
Hmm.
because he was always bad, but he always loved, in this case, his sister. So something happened where, it tipped him over the edge, and it just kind of developed from there. So and you look at, I suppose there's influences around things that you can watch, and some of the criminals out there, but also some of the true life stories, uh, uh, Ted Bundy and others.
Hmm.
It's
Sure.
things where, not necessarily copying what they've done because it's awful things that they've done, but leaning in on why do people do this? They always have their reason, and I kind of developed it from there. So there's some research into some of the criminals out there, but also someone else asked me, did you have to get into the mind of him as you were writing it? And I didn't really, because it was, his mind is an awful place to be. And it was almost, as I was writing it, I was almost witnessing it happening. It was a kind of a, strange moment where I had this idea of Peter, as I was on the keyboard writing it out, I wasn't in his mind. I was almost like watching something back, like a news report, or a television documentary of something that Peter had done, and I was just documenting it on paper, as I was writing it, rather than being in his mind.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great point, and that kind of leads to the question that really came up almost immediately for me, is that there are some parts of the story that portray some very violent acts,
Yeah,
and I'm sure they were kind of difficult to read. But I
yeah.
mean, you said it was almost as if you got out of your own self while you were writing them. Were those difficult to write, and did you have to like tone things down, or were you encouraged to? This isn't terrible enough. You have to ramp it up.
I always had in my mind he had to do something terrible to sort of warrant,
Hmm.
Levesque's vengeance kind of thing. Uh, um, and again, not to give away too much of the story, but Levesque is, I suppose, more noble than Peter. So it's not like he's, the opposite of Peter, but in a different skin. He is more noble. But as I was writing it down, as you say, I wasn't necessarily in his mind. I was watching it in a documentary point of view, and it was difficult to write. It was difficult, and I felt sorry for the characters that he was doing awful things to, and but that made it, I suppose, even more real. That as I was feeling sorry for these characters doing awful things too, it made me kind of, even as a writer, hate the character. You've got to love your characters that you create, but you also have to hate them for what they're doing, and it made me think that actually this kind of, there's this character out there, and there's people out there that do these sort of things, and it was difficult to write because I knew there was people out there doing these sort of things, and that made it difficult. But again, to answer your other question, I did tone it down a bit as well. So I wrote it as it is, you see it, but I did tone it down, thinking, is this too much? And the publisher kind of encouraged me to keep it in there because that was what was originally in my mind, and I didn't want to write violent for violence sake. I wanted to write it to kind of give the undertone of that character.
No, and that definitely came across in that capacity. One of the aspects I really enjoyed about the overall story about were the primary characters, both for the main and the supporting,
Mm.
that they all got some decent fleshing out and development, like in terms of their backstories, and then you start interweaving all the storylines and the subplots. Now, was that really challenging for you to put it all together? Did you think, okay, here's the father's story, and then here's the mother's story, and here's I think, oh, then the friend who's the babysitter.
Yeah.
That did you just kind of like have a list, like here's who I want to be in the story, here's a little bit about them, and then did you just start kind of like if you're putting all those strings together, or like and then the strings start to weave together to create one final storyline?
Yeah, and you know what? Going back to the comic book script I wrote originally, I had a lot of the characters already mapped out. The father, the mother, the babysitter, Levesque. There was other characters that there's a guy called Tommy who became more of a character in it than
Hmm.
he was in the comic books. He was just a bad guy in a situation, and caught the wrath of Levesque. But in the actual novel, there's more of a backstory to him as well. But I kind of had, it got to a point of almost confusing myself as I was writing it because there's certain timeline events that were going on before and then after, and then. putting it together. One thing that really helped actually was I don't know if you've heard of this software called Miro, but it's like this sort of whiteboarding. Rather than having a big whiteboard behind me, I use I suppose being in the IT industry, you kind of go into the tech side of things, but
Hmm.
there's a software out there called Miro. And you can do a Miro board, which is a big whiteboard that you can zoom in and out of. And I had these various timelines going around. And then I had chapters on one timeline, chapters another timeline, looping into the backstory of the characters that were also mapped out on this Miro board and pulled it all together, which actually made it a lot easier to map it out in that way. So I took a bit of a pause from the writing, mapped out in that way, and then it made the writing process easy as I understood the different timelines and how they interweave, along
Okay.
with the characters as well.
Sure, sure. So working on all these multiple storylines and subplots and all these characters, did you ever find yourself hitting a dead end or decide, okay, this, whatever it might be, just isn't working, and then did you maybe backtrack or start over and think, okay, there's something that's not clicking about maybe this character or about their story, and did you have to take a step back and try to figure out, okay, where did I don't want to say things went wrong, but where did things take a turn that did not work out the way I wanted it to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few times that happened, and I don't think I ever necessarily wholly deleted anything out. Obviously, edited, took things out, but in terms of the actual concept of it, I don't think I ever deleted anything out. But I think I got to a point, and this is where some of that Miro board mapping helped, is
Hmm.
that I wrote a chapter and read it out in its entirety with the book and thought this just doesn't fit. But actually, it did fit, but it fit earlier within the book. So there's things where I've moved things around. But also, I spent, think that there's things where I was reading things out and using Peter again as an example, where, I fleshed out his character a little bit, and it just still didn't seem like he was human. It felt like he is a bad person, but he didn't feel like he was human. So I had this idea of him, as a bit of an outlet for when he was younger, wanting to play the piano, and that kind of thing got interweaved into it as well to give a little bit of not necessarily for people to feel sorry for him, but to understand that there is a character there, and there's more to him than meets the eye. And the same thing that happened with Mary, who was the babysitter. That well, kind of the opposite actually. Had this whole backstory, which I actually wrote out in two or three chapters, thinking there's certain things that you can hint at, and other things you don't necessarily need in there. So I took things out and made that bit more concise. But it was important to still keep it, at least in my notes, to understand where Mary is as a character, and then just develop that into the story. So there's certain editing bits, certain adding things to it, certain removing things to it, but it never got to a stage of thinking this just isn't working and delete things out. And I think that's part of the process of the whole mapping it out. That as you're doing this, you might think, "Oh, this doesn't work." But actually, when you read it out and you move things around visually, you can think it doesn't work there. But what if it was there? Yeah, it does work there, and so that does help.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. The one thing I did want to ask you is that the thriller part of the story, because there's two primary storylines. There's the fantasy realm and the real world. And the real world portion, it takes place in 1986
Yeah.
Colorado. And I just thought that is such an unusual choice. And why? I guess for first, primarily why that geographic location, but as I was reading it, I can understand why you'd want to put it in 1986 because no internet, no cell phones, there's no easy solution where just someone whips out a phone and calls 911
Yeah.
or they call the police immediately. That it's all landlines and and computers are just used for video games. So I mean, what was the particular reasoning for those choices?
The 1986 thing, there was just something in there. I just thought it needs to be. I just wanted to set it in the 80s, and 1986 happened to be the year I started high school. Happened to be the year I had, certain computer games at home and that kind of thing,
Okay.
and it just felt like a nostalgic era to go back to. Albeit I wasn't living in Colorado, I was living in Staffordshire in the UK. But the Colorado bit, I always had in my mind that I was going to set it in America. I just didn't know whereabouts, and obviously it said Colorado, but it's a fictional part of Colorado. So there's elements of it in there, but there's the town and the city around it is fictional. Someone asked me the same question before, and I honestly am not entirely sure why I set it in America. I think it was partly to do with some of the influences, as I mentioned, was things that happened that specifically happened in the UK, and I suppose, wanted to distance it a little bit away from that, and rather than to sort of bring any unnecessary bad memories back to anyone that happened to, think of or read this and then think this is this relating to something that happened. And actually, in hindsight, you look at it, think they can't think that because, the whole story, is different, and it's just the times, the things that happened did help to influence it. But I think part of it was a little bit of a distancing thing, but also part of it was, I suppose, a conscious decision of setting it somewhere where, I'm not necessarily over familiar with, and it gave me that artistic edge to sort of create somewhere that I'm not overly familiar with, and create this sort of fictional town rather than sort of interweave it into a real place in my mind, if that makes sense.
Oh no, it definitely does because I was thinking that it felt very much like an American kind of story. Now I know these terrible types of crimes and situations happen elsewhere, but I guess for me it just had a very American feel to it. That it just seemed like yes, this is something that probably would have happened in the mid '80s
Mm.
in Central America or the well, not the Midwest, but the Rockies at least. And I just thought it was really interesting that someone who did not grow up in that kind of environment and that kind of location that they would decide, okay, I want to write a story here. So I guess it almost seems like, okay, how much research did he have to do to give it that air of authenticity?
Well, some of that authenticity came from the fact that as I was starting, the comic book script didn't mention Colorado. It could have been anywhere in America. It was just
Mm,
this town. But I work with people that live in various areas of Colorado, and it sounded such a beautiful place, and they were talking about it, that the mountains, the different seasons and everything else, and really warm in the summer, and all of this kind of stuff. And I thought it sounds like a fantastic place, and talked to them about it, and they gave me some descriptions, some photographs, and it came in my mind as I was writing the book. Actually, I'd love to set it in a place like Colorado, but the towns around or in Colorado is fictional. I mean, I suppose a little bit of an inside nod is that I call it Edge County. I used to have a motorhome, an RV, which was called an Edge, and I thought, what can I call this place? And then that came into my mind. So it's weird how some of the naming and influences came from that, but it's because I kind of knew some people in and around that area of Colorado that I helped to sort of set it in that way. But also the fact that these stories, it's book one in a hopefully a long series of it. There's nothing to say to stop it from being the next one to be somewhere else.
mm,
Although, there's a lady in the second one that if you've kind of read the preview of it at the end of book one, she's from Manchester in the UK, and so I've made it her a UK kind of character. But as I was developing or starting to develop that story, she goes back and forth from her hometown through to going to living in LA. So it could be anywhere in the world, these stories. So the souls that go into Levesque's realm, and not just necessarily American souls. It could be English, it could be French, it could be Spanish.
sure. So actually, that raises a great point. So I like to ask the writer, so what's next? I mean, it sounds like you've got maybe several books in mind or several other stories that involve, these gods of good and evil and this fantasy realm, but also its interaction with the human realm, if you will.
Yes. So I'm writing book two at the moment, and there's this sort of thing in my mind where I need to try and write it. I need to be in a way which is authentic to the audience of book one, but also to try and make it slightly different as well. So it's not necessarily the same human characters, but certainly the same God characters are going to be
Hmm.
in that. And it's setting, as I mentioned, it's going to be set in and around LA. Again, a fictional part of that, but one of the key characters, the key human characters, is very much near to my hometown, and she's from Manchester. So
Hmm.
um, yeah, and that's being developed, and trying to crack on with that. But I didn't have the benefit of having a comic book script already written for book two. So I actually wrote a script to it, just to go back to how I wrote book one, and then doing all this Miro board mapping and getting things sorted on that now. So probably about 20,000 words into book two at the
Oh
moment.
wow, that's fantastic. I think one of the interesting things for me is always that at least when you have a series that's in you, the first book, I guess, establishes the world and the rules,
Mm.
and the second book gives you the chance to expand on both worlds involved and maybe have some fun with the rules, and also you're definitely introducing more characters. Is that how book two is developing for you? I mean, are there so like there's another God character, or you said it takes place in Los Angeles, or you're probably having fun just if having things take place all over town.
Yeah, so again, there's fictional parts to it. So, in terms of the location, but there's it's fun to write because some of the rules that I wrote in book one were not necessarily fully fleshed out. I talked about the energy and things the energy plays a big part
Hmm.
in book two, and that some of the humans have discovered it and trying to create things for good with the energy, but it's causing some disruption, should we say? And the main antagonist in it is a guy which is not he's a bad guy again, and he's not necessarily a Peter kind of character, but there's certain things in there which as I'm writing it out, it's kind of developing his character into a way which may surprise people in terms of how that ends up being, finally being on the paper. And that not I'm not trying to give too much away, but he's not a god, and there's something more to him than human.
Okay, well, the book we've been talking about for most of today is James Bateman's Savior of Lost Souls. James, this has been a fascinating discussion, especially because we've had fantasy authors on before, but I don't know if we've had someone who's dealt with a story that involves both the fantasy realm and the human world. So it's a great I don't know, in between type of story. So where can people find out more about you and your books?
Yeah, I've got a website. It's www.jamesrbateman.com. I have a Facebook page with James R. Bateman author. I also have an Instagram, which is james.r.bateman.author, and also a TikTok. I think if you search for James R. Bateman on TikTok, you'll find that on there as well.
And is that you talking about your books?
I'm trying to talk about the books, but also adding some general life kind of experiences in there as well.
Fantastic. Well, again, the book is Savior of Lost Souls, and we've been talking with James R. Bateman. James, thank you so much for being here today.
No, my pleasure. Thank you, Paul.
Oh, of course, of course. Viewers, listeners, if you enjoyed today's show, please hit like. Feel free to leave a comment and subscribe. You can check out my screenwriting blog. It's maximumz.blog. I'm still on Twitter at maximum_Z, and this show has its own account there as well at podcast CWL. Still on Blue Sky and Instagram. Both of those are at Pez Screenwriting, and the show is also on Blue Sky at podcast CWL as well. And please feel free to check out my Go Ahead and Ask books, the ones on Amazon about screenwriting and pie. Like I said, that's James. I'm Paul, and this has been the Creative Writing Life podcast. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and most importantly, go write something.